So today we have an input and by the most appropriate person in this area from Comrade Andries Nel, who was one of the victims of the nomination process at the last elections, in my view. I think he was the outstanding deputy minister in the last administration. And in that capacity, he was really leading, I think for the first time, a comprehensive approach to what was called the Integrated Urbanization Development Framework. And so it's really on that topic that Comrade Andries will be addressing us today. But it's also in the context of the party's Red October campaign. It's triple H, so health, housing, hunger, plus W, water. And in particular, it's the housing dimension. And I'm pleased to see that in the title of the lecture, Comrade Andries, which he couldn't do when he was a deputy minister, he could have, but didn't, and I think advisedly didn't, has said from a Marxist perspective, essentially, which I think is exactly right. So, Comrade Andries, really looking forward to your input around this critical issue generally of the human settlement challenge, the big housing challenge, and how it impacts on everything else, actually, in our attempts to transform our country. So over to you, Andries. And thanks very much for being available and willing to do this. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Comrade Jeremy, and very, very good afternoon to all comrades. I think and thank you for the kind introduction. I think just to mention also that there are a number of other comrades who I see, and probably a number that I don't see, who are also really, really instrumental in the crafting of the Integrated Urban Development Framework and a whole number of other initiatives by government to transform the spatial realities of South Africa, and that would include things like the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Committee, which Comrade Jeremy was part of, Comrade Lechisa, both as a Deputy Minister of COGTA and later, sorry, Deputy Minister of Land Affairs, and later as Minister of COGTA, also played an instrumental role. I don't know whether Comrade Yunus Karim is here, but I mean, if anyone really can be cited as an individual who played a leading role in the IUDF, it would be him. But thank you very much to the leadership of the SACP for the invitation to make this input at the Jack Simons Party School. It's a really deep honor. Works such as Class and Color in South Africa by Comrade Jack and Comrade Ray, along with Time Longer Than Rope by Eddie Roux, I think certainly for me, and I'm sure for many of us, were absolutely foundational text in our political education. I think it's also appropriate that this input is taking place during the Red October campaign, dealing with hunger eradication, health, human settlements, and water. Three areas that are actually inextricably linked together. Also, it comes a day after the 31st of October, which is World Cities Day. The theme for this year was Better City, Better Life. And it also takes place in the run-up to the local government elections in 2021, probably less than a year from now. So these issues around human settlement, spatial transformation, I think are absolutely vitally important, both the long term and in the short term. My input is going to touch on really four broad areas. And I apologize, I must admit up front, it's not going to be a short input. So sorry for that. But I'm going to try to just sketch out a little bit of a theoretical framework. Secondly, talk a little bit about South African realities, in particular colonialism of a special type, and in particular also then the SACP positions around those questions. Thirdly, to look at ANC alliance and government policy framework, and if there's time, to speak a little bit about the IUDF, and to conclude with issues of implementation and some organizational issues. So firstly, in terms of the theoretical framework, The writer John Lanchester, author of a novel titled Capital, remarks in an article on the Brexit referendum that, I quote, "I once asked someone why, when I was at school, geography was about the shapes of rivers, but now all the best known geographers seem to be Marxists. He said, it's because when you look at a map and you see that the people on one side of some line are rich and healthy and long-lived, and the people on the other side are poor and sick and die young, you start to wonder why. And that turns you towards deep causal explanations, which then lead in the direction of Marxism." And I think the SACP has always had a very acute and profound understanding of spatial issues, and I'll return to that a bit later. I would have liked to have given a more comprehensive theoretical overview of a very rich body of Marxist theory on the production of space, on urbanization, on geography, writers and thinkers like David Harvey, Edward Soja, Mike Davis, Henri Lefebvre, Manuel Castells, to name but a few. But unfortunately, time doesn't allow for this. However, I'd like to suggest that the Jack Simons Party School organizes a session or a series of sessions devoted to this, because the centrality of understanding the production of space to both colonialism of a special type and the NDR can't be overemphasized. And I think just something like the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic alone has brought into very, very stark relief again the importance of space at so many different levels. And also issues of spatial inequality. I do, however, want to just give an overview of some of David Harvey's work on uneven geographic development. In his book, 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism, David Harvey discusses uneven geographic developments and the production of space. Harvey argues that capital strives to produce a geographic landscape that's favorable to its own reproduction and subsequent evolution. This landscape is perpetually unstable due to technical, economic, social, and political dynamics. Capital must adjust to this evolution much as itself plays a key role in shaping and driving the production of that landscape. And here a combination of two processes are of key importance. Firstly, the processes of endless capital accumulation in space and time. And secondly, the attempt to organize the space of the landscape in some systematic way through the exercise of state power. We must understand that the rules that govern the evolution of this landscape, and also understand that these rules have their own autonomous but contradictory logic. The independent evolution of the geographic landscape plays a key role in crisis formation. Harvey argues that this is central to the means in which capital reinvents itself, and that without uneven geographic development and its contradictions, capital would long ago have ossified and fallen into disarray. So capital and the capitalist state play a leading role in producing the spaces and places that ground capitalist activity. This is so because traversing space takes both time and money, and the economy of time and money is key to profitability. Marx refers to this as quote, the annihilation of space through time. This happens in two ways. Firstly, through the advancement of a variety of technologies, especially transport and communications technology. Secondly, on the type of capital that is being moved around. Money, for example, can now move almost instantaneously, whilst commodities generally are less, although increasingly mobile. Lower costs in transport and communications contribute to dispersal and decentralization, and capital can explore profit opportunities in a wide variety of places. The division of labor can be decentralized, offshoring is promoted, regional specialization becomes more pronounced. Also, new geographic patterns of production arise out of the sharpened spatial competition that's facilitated by cheaper and more efficient transport and communications. Time and cost of movement is also reduced by minimizing the costs of production and getting those commodities to the market. So-called agglomeration economies arise when many different capitals cluster together. For example, car parts, tire industries locating close to car manufacturing plants. This agglomeration extends beyond the economy and includes attitudes, cultural values, beliefs, and even religious and political affiliations. All of this necessitates a system of governance. Harvey argues that if the state did not exist, capital would have to create something to facilitate and manage its own collective conditions of production and consumption. And we'll touch upon this later, but something along these lines has happened in a number of our small towns in South Africa, where in fact capital has stepped up and either entered into competition with or run in parallel with local government. Dominant classes and hegemonic class alliances can form and lend a specific character to political as well as economic activity within the region. Regional economies form a loosely connected pattern of uneven geographic development. Some regions tend to become richer, while poor regions get poorer. There are limits, however, to the continuous centralization through agglomeration, because rising costs of living lead to wage demands that may ultimately make a region uncompetitive. Also, workers are better able to organize because of regional concentrations, further accentuating that process. When local costs rise rapidly, capitalists look for other spaces in the global economy to ply their trade, especially with the emergence of new technological and production mixes, and also where labor struggles are intense and acute. Regional crises of employment and production are often indicative of power shifts within the forces of production, within the forces producing the geographic landscape of capital, usually signaling a radical shift in the evolution of capital itself. The absorption of surpluses through geographic expansion and spatial reorganization helps to resolve the problem of surpluses lacking profitable outlets. And so urbanization and regional development become autonomous spheres of capitalist activity that require large investments, usually debt financed, that take many, many years to mature. In times of crisis, and I think it's relevant for where we are at the moment, globally and nationally, capital typically turns to these interventions for the absorption of capital and labor surpluses, often in the form of state-funded infrastructure projects to rekindle economic growth. However, such geographic expansions often threaten the values that are already fixed in place elsewhere. So Harvey argues that this contradiction is inescapable. Either capital moves out and leaves behind a trail of devastation and devaluation. Witness the Rust Belt in the United States, many of the tracts, deindustrialized tracts in Europe, also in South Africa. Or it stays put only to drown in the capital surpluses it inevitably produces, but cannot find profitable outlets for. This contradiction is sharpened by credit financing, because credit makes territories vulnerable to flows of speculative capital. And these flows can both stimulate and undermine capitalist development. Furthermore, the indebted country has to bear the cost of any subsequent devaluation of capital, while the creditor country is protected, paving the way for the plunder of the indebted country's resources. The export of capital has longer-term effects than credit money. For example, the surpluses of British capital and labor generated in the 19th century found their way to the colonies like South Africa, creating centers of accumulation, generating demands for goods from Britain. The contradictions arise because these new spaces of capital accumulation ultimately generate surpluses and need to find ways to absorb them through further geographic expansions, and this can spark geopolitical conflicts and tensions. Capital flows from time to time get redirected from one space to another, and Harvey argues that the capitalist system remains relatively stable as a whole, even though the parts experience periodic difficulties such as deindustrialization here or partial devaluations there. The overall effect of such interregional volatility is to temporarily reduce the aggregate dangers of overaccumulation and devaluation, even though localized distress may be acute. The general effect can be misleading since capital is always doing well somewhere. The illusion arises that it will be well everywhere if only we readjust the form of capital. Capital never has to address its systemic failures, Harvey argues, because it moves them around geographically. However, there are other possible outcomes. The fierce international competition can lead to crises of localized devaluation or geopolitical struggles between regions and states in the form of trade wars or ultimately military confrontations. And this then brings us to the question of how the relative spatial fixity and distinctive logic of territorial power as manifest in the state fits with the fluid dynamics of capital accumulation in space and time. This is an acute and abiding contradiction for capital, because in order for capital to circulate freely in space and time, physical infrastructure and built environments must be created that are fixed in space. The mass of all this fixed capital increases over time relative to the capital that is continuously flowing. Capital has periodically to break out of the constraints imposed by the world that it is constructed. A geographic landscape favorable to capital accumulation in one era becomes a fetter upon capital accumulation in the next. Capital has therefore to devalue much of the fixed capital in existing geographic landscape in order to build a wholly new landscape in a different image. This sparks intense and destructive localized crises, and capital unleashes the powers of creative destruction upon the land. Some factions of capital benefit from the creativity, whilst others suffer the brunt of the destruction. So the question then is, what is the role of state power in all of these processes of landscape formation? The state is a bounded territorial entity formed under conditions that might have had little to do with capital, but which is a fundamental feature of the geographic landscape. Within its territory, it has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, sovereignty over the law, and the currency and regulatory authority over institutions, including private property, and the power to tax and redistribute incomes and assets. The interests of the capitalist state are not the same as those of capital. The state is not a simple thing, and its various branches do not always cohere, as we will come to later. Although key institutions within the state do typically play a directly supportive role in the management of capital's economy, with treasury departments usually in alliance with central banks to constitute the state finance nexus. Harvey argues that the practices that constitute the exercise of state power are far from monolithic or even coherent, which means that the state cannot be construed as a solid thing exercising distinctive powers. It's a bundle of practices and processes assembled together in unbounded ways, since the distinction between state and civil society is highly porous. Capital is not the only interest to which the state must respond, and the pressures upon it come from a variety of interests. In the interstate system, there are always geo-economic and geopolitical relations and conflicts that reflect the state's distinctive interest and lead state practices into forms of action that may or may not be consistent with capital's interests. The logic that attaches to the territoriality of state power is very different from the logic of capital. The state is, amongst other things, interested in the accumulation of wealth and power on a territorial basis. It also seeks to rationalize the use of forces of capital to support its own powers of governmentality over potentially restive populations, all the while enhancing its own wealth, power, and standing within a highly competitive interstate system. This rationality contrasts with that of capital, which is primarily concerned with the private appropriation and accumulation of social wealth. The constructed loyalty of citizens to their states conflicts in principle with capital's singular loyalty to making money and nothing else. The kind of rationality the state typically imposes is illustrated by its urban and regional planning practices. These state interventions and investments attempt to contain otherwise chaotic consequences of unregulated market development. But the application of state powers to these purposes never did run smooth. They're all too easily subverted, co-opted, and corrupted by money interests, something that we'll also come to later. Conversely, the foundational interests of the state in, for example, the case of national security can be subverted by capital and turned into a permanent feeding trough for capitalist ambitions. It's the historical role of the infant complex in the development of capital. States can use their powers to orchestrate economic life not only through their command over infrastructural investments, but also through their powers to create or reform basic institutions. State decisions regarding, for example, the regulation of banks, for example, can have profound implications for regional dynamics. Reforms in the organization of international banking, coupled with information technologies, have over the past 40 years revolutionized global mobility of finance capital. The development of technologies such as jet transport, containerization, and the internet have changed the scales at which economic activity get articulated. The corporate shift in the global scale is far more pronounced. Accordingly, the sovereign powers of the state over capital and money flows have definitely been eroded over the past few decades. This, however, does not mean that the state is powerless, but rather that its power is more contingent on that of finance capital and the bondholders. State powers and practices have been more and more directed to satisfying the demands of corporations and bondholders, often at the expense of citizens. Changes in the movement of capital are also impacting on the scale at which state power might be constructed. So the political territorialization, such as the European Union, become not only more practicable, but more and more of an economic necessity. Changing space relations on the part of capital circulation and accumulation have transformative implications for configurations. For example, NAFTA, Mercosur, the EU, and also the expansion of the G7 to the G20. The geographic landscape of capitalism, as opposed to that of capital, is shaped by a multitude of interests as individuals and groups seek to define spaces and places for themselves against the background of the macroeconomic processes of uneven geographic development that the rules of capital accumulation and state power jointly effect. Uneven geographical developments conveniently mask the true nature of capital. Hope can spring eternal because there's always a successful neighborhood, region, or state where things are going right, even in the midst of multiple calamities. Macro crises get disaggregated into localized events that others elsewhere care even know very little about. Harvey points out that the landscape of capital plays a vital ideological role in contemporary life and politics. The capitalist city, for example, he says in a very elegant and emotive construction, that the capitalist city, for example, is built as a work of art in its own right, replete with fabulous architecture and competing iconic meanings. spectacular palaces of consumerism and the perpetual creation of postmodern urban spectacle contrasts with the suburban sprawl and gated communities, which in turn contrast with tenement housing, working class and immigrant neighborhoods, and in many cities of the world, large tracts of self-help housing. The capitalist city is the high point of capital's attempt to appear civilized and to represent the grandest of human aspirations, as any drive through Sandton will remind one. Harvey argues that uneven geographic development serves to move capital's systemic failings around from place to place. Those failings are a permanent or perpetually moving target. Furthermore, the homogeneity now being imposed by an international order dominated by the central banks and a few international institutions such as the IMF is, from this perspective, potentially devastating for capital's future chances of survival. This is an issue that I will take issue with towards the end. Harvey argues that it's doubtful whether unchaining uneven geographic development can today work by itself as a panacea for capital's malaise, given the storm clouds of systemic stagnation that are gathering strength and darkening the future. I think within all of this, it would also be very relevant to look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, both on issues of circulation of commodities, but also the shifts in the nature of work that are happening, also with profound geographic and spatial implications, amongst others, for cities and especially centers of cities. We see an emergent unholy alliance between state powers and the predatory aspects of finance capital to create a form of vulture capitalism that is as much about cannibalistic practices, economies of dispossession, and forced devaluations as it is about achieving harmonious global development. The vultures, like hedge funds and the private equity funds, will feed off the destruction of ways of lives in whole territories if necessary. Now, Harvey then argues that the political lesson to be drawn from this analysis is that anti-capitalist movements have to liberate and coordinate their own dynamics of uneven geographic development and the production of emancipatory spaces of difference in order to reinvent and explore creative regional alternatives to capital. Now, I mean, I've dwelt at length on Harvey's analysis because I think that analysis, especially of different spaces, is of particular relevance to us in South Africa, given our history of colonialism of a special type. So, but much as I find Harvey's analysis useful, given both the global conjuncture and our own legacy of CST that we're confronted with, I do have some reservations about his conclusion. The conclusion basically that a strengthening world order, and particularly a financial world order, is going to impose limitations on the ability of capital to circulate and save itself. I think his argument tends a little bit towards economism, and I think he doesn't pay sufficient attention to the political. But I think that could be a matter for debate and discussion. But I think it is a useful overall theoretical framework. The second broad area that I want to touch upon is South Africa, colonialism of a special type, and some of the positions and the analyses of the party over the years. I think just maybe to start with the road to South African freedom, 1962. Colonialism of a special type is described as this combination of the worst features of both imperialism and colonialism within a single national frontier, which determines the specific nature of the South African system and has brought upon its rulers the justified hatred and contempt of progressive and democratic people throughout the world. Road to Freedom also makes the point, and I think just again reinforcing the spatial awareness and the manner that analysis has been incorporated into the party's analysis for a long time, makes the point that workers of the towns, the Africans employed in factories and in transport, in steelworks and power stations and shops and offices, comprise the most dynamic and revolutionary force in South Africa. The wages of urban African workers in relation to their high living costs are scandalously low. They're forced to live far from their places of work, involving exhausting and expensive journeys by bus or by train. Then the road to the South African road to socialism, the SACP program for 2012 to 2017, I think also makes the point that some time in the past decade, for the first time in human history, the urban population of the earth outnumbered the rural, and that as market pressures, droughts, famines, and social instability have pressed down on rural areas, the world has urbanized much faster than was being predicted even in the bravest calculations just a few decades ago. The present urban population of over 3.5 billion is larger than the total population of the world in 1960. This huge wave of accelerated urbanization has been unlike any preceding it, not just in scale, but in its very character. It is urbanization largely without industrialization. And I think also very, very relevant for South Africa. Fully 1/3 of this now urbanized half of humanity is eking out an existence in the great sprawling slums of the town cities and the mega cities of the South. Goes on to say that CST was not just a constitutional dispensation, but that it marked other forms of stark duality, including social and spatial, and that those forms of duality, including the persisting dualities within the anatomy of our new democratic state itself, remain deeply embedded and are continuously reproduced, stressed, and are being continuously reproduced in our present reality. Further on makes the point that according to our national revolution has to be a revolution that addresses, for instance, the skewed nature of our infrastructure and CST patterns of development and underdevelopment that are evident in the spatial inequalities of our towns and cities, and in the divide between developed urban and devastated rural areas. And above all, that this kind of infrastructural transformation is not just about technocratic delivery. If it is to really be nation building, then it must actively involve the collective mobilized energies of millions of ordinary South Africans. But it then sounds a very relevant cautionary note, and that is that and this also touches upon some of Harvey's analysis, that the capitalist accumulation path in South Africa continues to be dominated by CST features. The economy is excessively export orientated, with this excessive orientation dominated by primary product exports. This particular dependent development path is reproduced by the domination of the commanding heights of our economy, by the mineral energy finance monopoly capitalist sector. And that domination in turn skews our economy in terms of logistics and spatial policy and natural resource policy, in particular in relation to water and energy. Further makes the point that excessive reliance on extractive mining has also created many spatial and logistic distortions, which are detrimental to long-term balanced growth and development. In relation to human settlements, the the party program recognizes and makes the point that we've succeeded in many cases beyond our wildest dreams in the building of houses, and that this has been a clearly progressive and necessary step. However, without the further transformation of our urban and rural spatial settlement patterns, and without effective funding models for municipality, this incorporation process has resulted in serious sustainability challenges. And the party program cites the example of Mangaung, which I won't go into in detail, but it really gives a very vivid illustration of what I think the president recently referred to as the 40-40-40 problem. People having to commute 40 kilometers a day, having to spend 40% of their income on transport, and also 40% of their time commuting. The program then outlines a number of interventions that would be necessary. One of them would be a better funding model for local government, as the transformation of our urban and rural spaces through mixed use, mixed income settlement patterns, through much greater public control over land use management and planning, and a focus on infrastructure that supports such transformation, including significant transformation of the public transport sector. Also, a major state-led infrastructure program that unlocks untapped resources, helps to develop neglected rural regions of our country, links actively with an industrial policy, and addresses economic dysfunctionality and social injustices associated with the apartheid spatial form of our urban spaces. Also, that prioritizes energy efficient infrastructure, rail over road, and helps drive effective links with our region and continent. Makes the point then also that all of these programmatic actions must also go hand in hand with a struggle to completely transform the spatial inequalities of our society. Housing and built environment policies must focus increasingly on building communities, not rows of houses, on appropriate densification, on the location of poorer communities much closer to amenities and places of work, and the deliberate construction of mixed income communities. Mobility and accessibility for working class communities, and especially for rural communities, must be addressed with much greater vigor. Now, I think a lot of these themes are then also taken up in this year's Red October campaign. And the section dealing with human settlements again applauds the construction of over 3 million RDP houses, but makes the point that owing to many factors, rapid urbanization, thanks to the abolition of apartheid control measures, has also put tremendous pressure and maintained that backlog. But the shortage was also compounded by second and third generation family members in overcrowded township homes seeking their own dwellings, that the net impact has been a huge expansion of informal settlements as well as extensive informal backyard dwellings. The RDP housing built has been beset with a number of problems. Instead of a publicly owned construction capacity or of a people's brigade approach to housing construction, new township housing has been outsourced with all of the attendant problems of corruption, shoddy workmanship, manipulation of housing lists, etc. Of which the Free State Asbestos project is one of the more industrial scale examples of looting in the housing sector. The focus on houses alone and not on viable human settlements with local employment possibilities and with recreation and other communal amenities has seen the replication of apartheid era dormitory township patterns. To make matters worse, in order to maximize the number of houses within a limited budget, and without the will to expropriate well-located land, most RDP settlements are on the distant margins of towns and cities where the land is cheapest. Once again, we have replicated apartheid spatial patterns and enforced long-distance migrancy on much of the working class. So for Red October campaign, the party with allied formations will take forward a campaign for active transformation of human settlements, including through cancellation of private housing contracts where there are not the required skills, with all of the money is recuperated, a major people-driven program based on CWP principles for the upgrading of well-located informal settlements, the expanded construction of rental stock and the effective regulation of rentals, addressing security of tenure while working class households appreciate getting title deeds. The current title deeds regime is inappropriate for the realities of most or the majority of households. Security of tenure and security of access to productive communal land is especially critical for the 1/3 of South Africans, especially rural women living in the former quote-unquote homelands. And lastly, urban land reform, including expropriation of well-located land for mixed use, mixed income development, must be fast-tracked. Then comes the third area that I want to touch upon is just the broad policy framework. And I'm not going to dwell at length. I think it's another area that one would want perhaps at a future engagement to really go into a bit more depth, both about the content and the evolution of the different policy instruments. But I just want to touch upon a couple. I mean, 1992, we developed Ready to Govern, which also outlined a vision for human settlements and spatial transformation, as did the Reconstruction and the Development Program in 1994. 1995, the then Department of Housing developed an urban development framework, which I'm not sure whether it really went anywhere. Then in 2001, we had the Urban Renewal Program and the Integrated Sustainable Rural Development Program, which targeted a number of areas. I think it was about 38 areas. Again, came to a fairly abrupt end with results that were quite mixed. Then in 2011, we had the National Development Plan, which devoted an entire chapter 8, to transformation of the national space economy. And if you go through the National Development Plan, I mean, for all of its own challenges, it is a very spatially aware document. Flowing out of that, then in 2016, the Integrated Urban Development Framework was adopted. And at the moment, even though it's not a policy instrument in the sense that the others are, we've also introduced the district development model since 2019. Now, I mean, if time allowed, and I see that I'm already at 42 minutes, so I would have wanted to go into the key elements of the IUDF, but that could maybe be done either in engagement or at a later stage. Just to make the point that we like saying that all of these are very, very good policies, but the challenge is with implementation. And indeed, I'm not wanting to dispute that these are good policies, but I do think that we need to be a little bit less glib about repeating that mantra about good policy, poor implementation. Because I think the question does arise at some point is, can policies that we are either unwilling or unable to implement really be good policies? And what does this say about our planning and policy making processes? I think that's maybe an issue that we can engage upon. My fourth and last section is then indeed just dealing with questions of implementation and certain organizational issues. Really trying to address the question of why have we not implemented, or why have we not successfully implemented many of the policies in this policy framework. I want to touch upon really 4, 5 broad areas. I think the first point that I want to make is that we must be mindful of the overall socioeconomic development trajectory that we are pursuing. And I think the points made in Harvey's analyses, and also that come across very strongly in the party's program, really suggests that the structure of our economy, I mean, built around mining, mineral, mining, energy, finance, really has profound implications for spatial development. And many of the policies that we adopt and attempt to pursue, I would argue, would continue to run into the realities of that development trajectory. And so in order to effect the spatial transformation that we desire and that we spell out in those policies, I think also very concerted attention needs to be given to the overall structure and trajectory of the economy. I think here just a short note on the Red October campaign. I mean, the focus for this year's campaign is hunger eradication, health, housing, or human settlements rather, and water. I know that it wasn't completely off the agenda, but I mean, I think one would want to suggest that the theme of some of the early Red October campaigns around the financial sector must really continue to remain very, very strongly on the agenda. Because without addressing the manner in which finance and finance capital operates, I think we're going to have limited prospects of having profound, meaningful spatial transformation. So I think that's the first that, and I think it would be good if also in discussion we take some of that forward, is the impact of our overall socioeconomic development trajectory on issues of spatial transformation, and then also human settlements, of course. The second broad point is more of a political, cultural one, and that is the very deep ambivalence that we have within our movement and in society towards the urban question. Now, I think part of that ambivalence springs from a genuine concern for the need to remain focused on the rural question in order to deal fundamentally and decisively with the legacy of colonialism of a special type, because it's those former homeland areas that continue to bear the brunt of multiple deprivation. And if we don't deal decisively with that, we would be failing the ultimate objectives of the NDR, and we won't deal with the legacy of CST. However, there's an ambivalence and a negativity towards the urban question that I think spring from less honorable motives. I mean, some of it is a cultural opposition between the rural and the urban, and all of the cultural and the value systems that are argued to attach to those two spatial realities. And I think this manifests particularly strongly on the part of traditional leaders and many forces that ally themselves with traditional leaders and a particular outlook. I experienced that, I mean, in a previous life, where at a Contralesa meeting, I was requested to do a presentation on the IUDF, which I did. And the audience listened very attentively, very politely. And when I finished, a hand went up, and the intervention was that, look, Deputy Minister, we listened to you to the conclusion of your input because we respect you and we hold you in high regard personally, but we actually did want to stop you, and we would have stopped you if we didn't hold you in that regard, because your input is saying that South Africa is already 2/3 urbanized. By 2030, it will be 70%. By 2050, it will be approaching 80%. That for us as traditional leaders is really pronouncing a death sentence on us. It's announcing our obsolescence. It's tantamount to pronouncing the end of us and our institution. And they interpreted the input that I had given not as stating certain developmental realities, but interpreted that as a pronouncement of intent on the part of government in order to drive urbanization to those levels, with what they perceived to be the detrimental effects. We obviously then had further engagements with them and made the point that, in fact, it's in many of the rural areas under the control within the jurisdiction of traditional leaders that are undergoing extremely rapid densification. In the phrase of Mike Davis, that urbanization in a South African context is not just about the peasant going to the city, but also the city coming to the peasant. That there are rural areas that are undergoing extremely rapid densification. And if traditional leaders are not engaging, that they're going to find themselves in a lot of trouble, and therefore it would also be in their interests to engage with the IUDF. But there's a very, very strong resistance that also plays itself out in the resistance of traditional leaders and other forces to policy instruments like Spatial Planning, Land Use Management Act, SPLUMA, on the whole question of security, of tenure rights, land rights, etc., etc. So that's, I think, one ambivalence and concern towards dealing with the urban question. The second is a political one that also emanates from a particular analysis of the electoral strengths and weaknesses of the ANC and the alliance. And the argument goes that the ANC is the main support base, electoral support base of the ANC is rural, that we're losing support in urban areas, and therefore our attention politically, organizationally, but also in terms of government programs must be directed at rural areas and consolidating our rural base. And I think it's I mean, again, it's not for one moment to suggest that we should not be allocating the bulk of our efforts to addressing the realities of CST in rural areas. But I think it is a fundamentally flawed and dangerous analysis to say that we must neglect the urban at the expense of the rural. I mean, I always recall the 2008 election campaign in Zimbabwe, being an observer there and seeing ZANU campaign under the slogan, land is the economy, economy is the land. Now, in a context where the bulk of your country and your own base is a rural peasant base, that might have some sense. But what does that slogan say to the urban working class? What does it say to the middle strata? What does it say to the urban youth, to students, to intellectuals, etc.? And indeed, those were exactly the sectors of society that deserted ZANU for the opposition. So I think we need to be very careful about that mechanical juxtaposition that doesn't see the very close interrelationship between the rural and the urban. The other concern about the urban question also, I think, springs from our own internal organizational realities, where increasingly we find the construction of geographically, regionally based power bases based on patronage and also worryingly, increasingly on ethnic mobilization. And again, the tendency is for those bases to be more easily constructed and maintained in rural areas, and sometimes, although not always, a bit more difficult to maintain in certain sectors of an urban environment. So I think, I mean, all in my concluding point under that section would be that I think it would be very important for the party to also play a leading role in doing ideological and political work on a proper, rigorous understanding and an analysis of the urban question and the relationship between the urban and the rural. And I think it is that ambivalence which also has really, in many cases, put a question mark over the political will to really drive a coherent program of urban-rural development. The third broad area that I want to touch upon is the question of policy coherence and conflicting policies and policy imperatives. I don't want to be misunderstood here as to be critiquing any one of the policies that I'm going to mention, but just to point out that there are contradictions, and those contradictions, in a sense, I suppose, are inevitable. But the important point is that we recognize when we are pursuing policies that contain contradictions, and that we're then able to mitigate and to manage those. To just cite a couple of examples, I mean, we at one level pursue a policy of promoting clean, green energy, saving energy, giving incentives for people to get off the grid, increasingly also the question of self-generation. And again, I mean, there's a lot that is positive about that. At the same time, though, we maintain a policy framework that says that in terms of local government financing, our local government financing model, that municipalities must derive a substantial portion of their revenue from the sale of energy. Now, I mean, at some point, those two policies are going to come into sharper and sharper contradiction with each other. And we need to be proactive in how we deal and how we mitigate that. The second would be, for example, that we have one set of transport policies that favor the promotion of public transport, lessening the use of cars, but at the same time, we would have a industrial policy that promotes the manufacture of cars. And again, I want to stress, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be manufacturing cars, but again, how do those, what's the interrelationship between those sets of policies? Added to that, the subsidy policy in relation to public transport, the fact that we subsidize buses and rail, but the vast bulk of commuting is happening on taxis. Last example would be that we state very, very clearly in all of our policy instruments the objective of spatial transformation, but the way that we then conduct our public housing program often stands in very sharp contrast. And I mean, even some of the more recently opened and launched developments, one can also question whether they are really in keeping with the fundamental vision of spatial transformation contained in these documents. The fourth point around why we struggle with this policy implementation would, for me, revolve around the capacity of the state. And I think the first issue to highlight would be just the institutional framework and the capacity to plan. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, then that framework is incoherent, disjunctive, and the capacity to plan, I mean, really is very, very limited. I mean, one sometimes wonders whether, you know, whether that capacity exists more than in name. Secondly, and related to that, is the question of the structure and the location of spatial planning. I mean, the challenge that we have is that is a highly fragmented area. For example, you have a Department of Human Settlements that has a human settlements spatial framework that has policy instruments. You have a Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, which is responsible for local government and which is responsible for the integrated urban development framework. Then you have a Department of well, what used to be Rural Development and Land Reform, now Land and Agriculture, which is responsible for the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act. There's a further question as to which aspects of SPLUMA belong in the presidency with the Planning Commission and which with Land Affairs, etc., etc. So really, even having a very good set of policies, your institutional framework is so fragmented that it really raises serious questions as to whether, based on the current institutional arrangement, one will ever make really significant progress. Third point under capacity of the state is then also just the question is the capability or the capacity to monitor and evaluate the implementation of these programs, which I think had been gaining traction and ground, but I think that ability is still very, very far from where it should be. And the problem is that often that monitoring and evaluation is conducted as an exercise that stands separate from your overall planning and implementation processes. You know, it's something that once a quarter or whatever, DPME would come and present really, really well-researched, very, very thoroughly executed studies of monitoring and evaluation, but one wasn't always sure where that was going. The fourth issue under the capacity of the state is the capacity, the ability of the state to mediate contradictions both within the state and within society. And sometimes those contradictions really find extremely, extremely sharp expression when it comes to issues of spatial development. And instruments like the NDP call for the formation of local social compacts, but really the ability of the state to engage in that is extremely limited. And it's limited, and sometimes for reasons of technical capacity, but also the questions of state capture and policy capture, which, I mean, regrettably find expression at all levels of the state, but in particular, the local level of the state is often very vulnerable to those forms of capture. I think what's worrying is that hitherto, a lot of the discourse around state capture has centered on issues of procurement. What is less talked about, and which is arguably more sinister, are the questions of corruption and capture around decisions pertaining to land use, zoning, etc. And this is an area where opposition parties such as the DA in particular, if one reads the works of Comrade Chippy Olver, for example, you know, on Cape Town, really illustrates how that has happened. Regrettably, I mean, ANC municipalities are also waking up to actually how lucrative corruption around land use decisions are, and how much more difficult it is, because it's such a complex and technical exercise, how much more difficult it is to catch people, much more difficult than procurement issues. I want to conclude that capacity of the state sector just by referring to the situation of Waterberg. There are two really excellent studies done by the Public Affairs Research Institute, PARI, on Mogalakwena and Lephalale. I think very insightful. In the case of Mogalakwena, really highlighting the question of how the interface between party and state becomes blurred, how there's a self-replicating pattern of people mobilizing in order to gain political power, in order to access resources, and then accessing resources in order to reinforce their positions within the party in order to maintain. And just in the case of Mogalakwena, how that really developed to the point of comrades being assassinated, of the mayor and the municipal manager walking around with teams of bodyguards more numerous than the president, etc. In the case of Lephalale, really demonstrating the imbalance between the state at a local level, especially in more rural areas, and big institutions of big capital. And in the case of Lephalale, parastatal SOEs such as Eskom, but also former privatized SOEs such as ISCOR, really with their resources, and of course mining capital and agricultural capital, really playing a leading role in taking decisions around spatial development. In certain cases, even providing the municipality with planners. And really that inequality, not, I mean, corruption certainly, but just the imbalance in power and technical capacity, really resulting in a very profound lack of spatial transformation and a perpetuation of apartheid spatial patterns. And decisions, spatial decisions, really being skewed to particular interests as opposed to an interest that would serve a community as a whole. My last point under these questions of implementation would be questions of the capacity of the ANC and of the alliance as a whole. I think firstly, as I referred to earlier, we need to really look at policy making, how we make policies, and make policies that are also implementable given our reality. Secondly, the ability to monitor and evaluate the implementation of those decisions in government. The issue of being rooted in communities, being able to play a leading role in those local planning processes, utilizing the avenues being created by the district development model for greater popular participation in those processes. And in that regard, I think the need for the party to also strengthen campaigns like the Know Your Neighborhood campaign, and the fact that the party is organized on a VD basis, I think really puts it in a position to play a very meaningful role along with other organizations in the alliance. The overall state of the alliance, relations within the alliance, I think, are a matter of major concern. And the fact that the alliance doesn't always function the way that it does also blunts our ability as an alliance to pursue those programs of spatial transformation. In particular, also, the problems besetting the civic movement, I think, are of major concern in that regard. And then lastly, I mean, the inability to mediate the contradictions both amongst us within the alliance, but also within the different component parts of the alliance. The fact that more and more we see that individuals in leadership structures are aligned in different ways to different interests. And that is really often at the root of our inability to implement decisions and policies, not necessarily because we don't have the capacity to do so, but we aren't able to deal with the questions of how the benefits of those decisions should be apportioned. And I mean, that, of course, then also relates to issues of corruption and of capture. So, Comrade Jeremy, oh gosh, so my apologies. I've actually overshot the hour, but I am at an end. And so I think just in conclusion to again thank the party for the opportunity, and really just to emphasize the point that the party must always lead us in asking the question why people on one side of some line are rich, healthy, and long-lived, and the people on the other side are poor, sick, and die young. But more importantly, that it must lead in giving those deep causal explanations that enable us to unite in action to erase those lines and to transform that geography. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Andries. You used the time well. And I said at the beginning, I can't think of anyone better qualified and more thoughtful about these complicated issues and the interconnection between many things than yourself on the issue of human settlements more broadly and the whole spatial economy and its crises here in South Africa. So, comrades, what we'll do now is open up